A remote Manitoba First Nation is taking Ottawa to court this week for failing to provide the reservation with safe drinking water. Manitoba First Nation has been under a boil water advisory since 2018. The community filed a class action lawsuit back in 2022, and they're seeking compensation for access to clean drinking water. But the federal government argues it is not legally responsible to provide it. For more, I'm joined this morning by Keisha Thompson. She's an associate lawyer for Duboff Edwards Schachter Law Corporation in Winnipeg. Good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
I think a lot of Canadians, myself included, were surprised to hear that argument from the federal government that although we believe it's a right to clean drinking water, who is legally responsible for providing it? I want to start with this statement from Indigenous Services Canada, which says everyone in Canada should have access for reliable, safe, and clean drinking water. In December 2023, the Minister of Indigenous Services introduced Bill C-61. Bill C-61 puts First Nations voices at the forefront and creates tools First Nations need to ensure clean drinking water for generations to come. It will also hold governments accountable to provide long-term, sustainable funding towards water services in First Nations. So I'll ask you this morning, is the federal government legally responsible to provide clean drinking water?
Right. And so that's something that the federal court will decide. Ultimately, in Canada, it's an issue that we've never seen the courts decide. The last time this issue, and most recently, when this issue went before the federal court, Canada settled in the Tataskwayak Cree Nation class action lawsuit. And so the lawsuit that we're seeing brought by Chief Hill and Ottawa First Nation is effectively the sequel of that class action, which settled. And so a judge didn't make a decision on that issue, and it's likely that a judge will make a decision on the issue in the coming year.
I want to ask you about the Safe Drinking Water Act. There have been several amendments to the Safe Drinking Water Act for the First Nations Act in the last 10 years. I'm curious to know where it stands right now.
Yeah, it's a great question because in 2013, the previous Harper government passed the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act. And one of the commitments by Canada, which is a legally binding commitment from the settlement that they made in 2021, was that they would repeal that legislation and they would pass their own legislation that governs water treatment, as well as funding for nations and reserve lands. And that, as the Indigenous Services Canada representative outlined, was introduced by Minister Haidu in 2023. What we know is that it passed a second reading June, a couple months ago, and that it's headed to the standing committee. But there isn't currently specific legislation that regulates water on reserve land.
The United Nations recognizes access to clean drinking water as a basic human right. Why then wouldn't the federal government be responsible for providing that?
Right. And so that recognition by the UN was made in 2010. And so what we see is Canada had passed legislation in 2013 as a step towards trying to regulate and provide funding to address this issue. What we see in the statement of defense that Canada filed, although they're denying legal responsibility, they're denying they don't have a duty, a fiduciary, they don't have, that it's not a breach of the honor of the Crown for them not to provide safe and clean drinking water. We also see that the federal government has made a promise and spent a lot of money to try to fix this issue. The reality for Manitoba First Nation is that they have a water treatment plant that is currently under construction. And what we saw in Canada's legal defense in the formal court documents that they filed is that they expect that that will go online next summer. But that doesn't help for those that are turning on the taps this morning on the reserve.
Keisha Thompson, I want to thank you for joining us this morning. An interesting case to follow, and we will be following along with you. Thank you for coming on Your Morning.
Thank you for having me.
If you liked that video, make sure to subscribe to the Your Morning YouTube feed, where you can find all kinds of new content posted every weekday morning.